So today we're going to be talking about 10 keys to ensuring the success of your Skype for Business deployment. This is a kind of business best practices track. It's not super technical. I do like the technical stuff. This is not SIP traces. This is business best practice focus. If you do have techie questions, catch me afterwards, catch me tomorrow, we can go through those. If you've got questions, happy to have them throughout the session. It's usually better to ask them while I'm on the topic, to be honest. If you can jump up to the mics, that's really great because it gets on the recording. If you can't, just shout at me and I'll repeat the question. So who am I? What do I know about this anyway? Why do you listen to me? My name's Tom Arbuthnot, and I've had about 5 years doing this as now a principal solutions architect at Modality Systems. Modality are a PGI company, and our entire focus is around the kind of Link and now Skype for Business ecosystem and stack. I'm a certified master, I'm an MVP, so various badges, but the really important thing is I've done this a few times in global deployments around the world, different verticals, retail, finance, professional services, and particularly in the last couple of years, a focus on finance. And I mention that particularly because there's some real interesting use cases in finance and professional services. If you can keep those guys happy, then you stand a fighting chance of keeping everybody else happy, is my experience. I've also had experience of Skype for Business throughout the TAP program. So although it's relatively new to market in terms of Skype for Business Online and Skype for Business Server, we've been playing with it at Modality for a few months now. And also, I guess this last point, just for those who are in migration or have existing PBXs, I spent about 5 years working as a Cisco partner as well, doing their UC stack. So I've been on both sides of the fence. I've done the integrations, and I've felt the pain and learned a lot from the experience. So what are we going to cover today? As the title says, 10 key areas. And it's not really just bullets of what you need to do, but it's areas you need to carefully consider during your migration to Skype for Business. Based on real-world experience, there's about 90 people now at Modality Systems, offices in the US, the UK, Australia, so anything from kind of schools, government, retail, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals. So I'm hopefully, from my experience and the company's experience, I'm covering most of the verticals in the room, I would guess. And, as I said, ask questions as we go. So number one, and after just saying that the order does not signify the importance, I think this is probably the most important point. Business user buy-in. We're at a technical conference. There's probably a bent towards technical audience. Get excited, new features, new stuff, it's all really cool. But you've got to remember that your job is to improve the business user's experience. That's number one. It's easy to get excited about we can do video conferencing, we can do voice, we can do collaboration, we can work from home. But think about how you're going to improve that user's experience. To get business users on board, you need to kind of engage early and engage often. There's quite a lot you can do in Skype for Business, and you really can't get it all across in one meeting with the business saying, this is going to be great, we're going to do instant messaging, presence, voice, video, collaboration, it's going to be awesome, and then next thing you deploy it. That just doesn't work. You need to engage at different parts of the business, multiple times, and kind of get some business sponsorship. And that might be on-the-ground sponsorship from particular working teams, or it might be exec sponsorship if you can get it. We see people deploy in terms of business buy-in in two ways. You either start with certain teams in the business and build some buzz and work your way up, or you kind of come in at the top level, the CIO, the MD, the CIO level, and persuade them that Skype for Business is going to help change the business experience for the better. Both are valid approaches, neither's right or wrong necessarily. Going in at the top is often an easier experience because there's some kind of pressure through the business to do it, but equally growing organically can work. You've got to support the cultural change. again, with a technology bent, you kind of sometimes underestimate how much of a change this can be for people. You're going from potentially a PBX phone that this person has had for 5, 10 years, they've done the same thing day in, day out, they're very happy with their routine, very happy with their experience. There's a whole bunch of good reasons to be deploying Skype for Business. Now they can work from home, they can work from Starbucks, they can federate with other businesses, they can do video and voice and collaboration at the drop of a hat. But you can't just give this to people and A, expect them to just magically understand that, or B, not to kind of feel some change and feel maybe unsure about the change or not sure about how to use this tool compared to their old tool. So as well as deploying, you have to support this cultural change. You're enabling new ways of working, but make sure the business understands that it's going to be some change and it's a change for the better. While it might be different, and actually I quite liked my phone, remind the user that, well, this is enabling new ways of working, we're more competitive, we're going to be faster to make decisions, faster to collaborate. That helps people understand, okay, I'm feeling some change. It might not be the smoothest thing for me personally, but I understand where we're going and why we're doing it. Measure success and gather stories. This is really important. I don't see it enough, unfortunately. And measuring success can take lots of different forms. It's how many people are deployed, how many instant messages you're sending, how much conferencing you're doing. There's a whole bunch of stats you can gather out of Skype for Business monitoring, where you can kind of wave them and say, this is great, and we're doing this much of this, and 1,000 IMs a day, whatever it is. But it's also stories. It's success stories in the business. So something we like to do is to go and find kind of power users, key users in the business who are maybe doing more than average in terms of video, or more than average in terms of federation. Go and try and get 5 or 10 minutes with those users and just say, look, we appreciate you using the tool, it's really great, is there anything we can do to help you? But also, why have you taken it up so well? What are you doing? Can we take your story and kind of feed that back into the business? Because nothing resonates better than talking about parts of your business, teams, departments, heads of departments, and saying, look, they're finding that they're using Skype for Business meetings for their Monday morning collaboration session, and it's been so much better than doing it over audio. That kind of story tends to resonate better with business users than you arbitrarily saying, oh, we're sending 1,000 IMs an hour or 1,000 IMs a day. It's the stories that get people's buy-in more than just the stats, as much as the stats are fun. And in terms of promoting those success stories, use your intranet, your emails, whatever you do to push that data around. If you've got the opportunity or you've got an in-house marketing team, I've seen some bigger customers do kind of video case studies internally. So a little, it doesn't have to be super professional or anything, just a little, here's what we're doing, here's why Sarah in marketing is absolutely loving using Skype for Business. You'll be surprised how much impact that can have, particularly across departments. If one department's using it heavily and one department's not, well, how can you help bridge that gap? Even better if you can get those people to then become sponsors for your rollout going forward. So maybe they become the spokesperson that talks to other departments that aren't using the technology quite as heavily as they are. IT and telecoms buy-in. I deliberately kind of slash those because in most companies I work in, IT and telecoms are still separate. Sometimes telecoms is bundled with network if people are using an IP telephony system. Often, and it's not unheard of, to have an IP telephony team, a telephony team where they're using old school TDM or analog or digital, and then the IT team or the Skype for Business team. You can't be successful without getting those guys to buy in, and not just in the immediate team, as in I have someone in the telecoms team who's working with me to make Skype for Business a success, but IT as a whole have a massive influence on the opinion that the business holds of this technology. It should be that IT are the champions of Skype for Business, not that they're the ones that are kind of reluctantly being dragged along. often what we'll try and do is we'll deploy with IT first. There's two benefits to that. IT guys will give you feedback usually, good or bad, and sometimes more articulately than business users in terms of actionable stuff, sometimes not, depends on your IT department. But what it does give you an opportunity to do is ensure that IT guys are happy with the technology, so your support teams, not just the comms teams, but the whole IT department or service are happy with the technology before it goes out to the wider business. You really want those guys to be supporting the change so that when the business users use the technology and they talk to IT, it's not, oh, what's coming? Well, we're not sure either. We're getting it at the same time as you. It's, oh, Skype for Business is great. We've been using it for 2 months and we've been collaborating on it and you'll be fine and it's all good. Because you'd be surprised how much the opinion of IT bleeds into the business. And particularly if it's unsure or negative, everybody says, well, if IT aren't sure about it, then as a business user, I'm not so sure. In terms of telecoms specifically and networks, they're absolutely pivotal to the success of Skype for Business. You rarely deploy Skype for Business and don't integrate to the existing telephony infrastructure. Occasionally, really rarely, you can do a big bang deployment where one day you're on a PBX and the next day you're on Skype for Business. But more often than not, you're going to be connecting the two. And you have to be sensitive to the telecoms team. There's a whole bunch of stuff coming in that potentially is displacing some of the stuff they do today. There's still a lot of stuff in Skype for Business that requires the telephony skill set. There's gateways, ISDNs, SIP integrations. So it's rare you're displacing a department as such, but there's certainly some kind of skill set gaps to be bridged, some training opportunities, and you need to bring those guys in and not make them the enemy, because often they'll have a big impact on the success. If Skype for Business doesn't work well with the existing PBX, so for example, I used to be able to dial 4-digit extensions to talk to PBX users, and on Skype for Business I can't because my trunk to the PBX doesn't work like that. That impacts real users and it will have a negative effect. You need those guys on board, making sure the integration is strong so the user experience is consistent. And in terms of deployment, without going too much into the technical stuff, there's 2 ways to integrate to your PBXs at a high level. You can either have a gateway in front of the PBX, in which case the gateway becomes the authority for your call routing, and the Skype for Business team, and I use that phrase loosely, but the people responsible for Skype for Business, which might include telecoms, control that routing, which is great because me as an external consultant and a company that deploys this, we're in control, we can see what's going on, we can route calls, make sure everything works. But also it's seen as risk potentially to the telecoms team because you're in front of them in the call flow, and if your stuff goes wrong, they could be impacted. The other option is the gateway behind the PBX, and then precisely the opposite is true. So then the PBX is in control of the primary call routing, and you are a slave as Skype for Business behind the PBX. PBX guys find that more comforting, safer, it's a kind of slower way to roll out. But then you've got a black box of your calls between Skype for Business, the gateway, the PBX, and then your carrier. So that's a conversation to have, again, on the more techie side of the scale, but with your PBX and your networks team. How are you going to deploy, and how do you deal with issues when there's a PBX in the call flow? For better or worse, quite often PBXs just tick along. So you might find in-house you've got a PBX team that do moves, adds, and changes, but have they got the skill to deal with call flow issues with 2 PBXs, their PBX and Skype for Business in play, or do they need support around that area? So think about that and make sure you've got that team on board and they're ready to help with the success.
Is that gateway a separate device, or would it be software-based surrounded?
Yeah, so I use Gateway. It can be a software, it can be a virtual device or a physical hardware device, or it could even be a session border controller is a pure SIP gateway. So you might hear the terms gateway and session border controller used interchangeably. Typically it's physical, but it can be software. Thank you. Business policy decisions and workflow changes. This is another area that gets neglected pretty commonly. So you're doing a Skype for Business project, you're all excited, you're going to enable everybody to collaborate, everybody to federate. They can do open federation, they can talk to customers, they can talk to partners. All is good. Two things often go wrong. You get in and you start telling the business users all the stuff they can do, but you haven't engaged with the decision makers that decide if those things go on or off. So your information assurance, your IS, IA teams, or you talk about all those features and then for some regulatory reason they can't have them, or rollout reason, whatever it is. So when you engage the business, make sure you're talking early about the new features you're going to be able to provide to the business and get the business on board with them. Talk to them about, we can now work from home, so how does that impact HR policies around working from home? You know, it's all well and good your training saying you can work from home, but if the policy is people can't, then there's a disconnect there. Mobile devices and federation is the big one. People get hung up on federation quite a lot. For those that don't know it, it's the ability to have your Skype for Business client, instant messages, presence, voice and video, another Skype for Business deployment. So customer A can talk to customer B. But also it potentially enables the ability for your customer deployment, customer A, to talk to Skype consumer as well. So you can talk to your customers if they're consumer customers, or you can just have collaboration between businesses that are using Skype consumer. That's, even though we would frame it similar to email, anybody can talk to anybody, that is a big change for some businesses that are worried about, well, you can desktop share on Skype for Business, so do I want you to be able to desktop share with partners? Because what might they see? Or I can just set up an instant video conference with 2 or 3 customers, is that okay? You want to engage early and get the relevant teams and decision makers on board with that technology so that when you come to deploy it, you don't deploy it only to be halted or pulled back while that decision gets made. And the earlier you engage, the better response you get. If you come in late, you've already deployed, and then you go and talk to the information assurance guys, you've probably already got their backup, past experience would say. So engage early, you know, we value your opinion, can we talk you through how this works and how we think it's going to benefit the business, and how can we find a way to work together to enable these features. Last one, the traditional PBX workflows might change, and often will change. We see departments built around PBX features. For example, group pickup, call park. My team works like this. They have a certain break rotation and they use call pickup to cover that break rotation. Always have, that's how they work. And it's quite hard sometimes to say, well, Skype for Business comes with all this new features and functionality, but we are going to have to change your workflow there because it works slightly differently to the way the PBX works. It's rare you can't find a way to bridge the requirements or the user workflow, but it might be they're going from a group pickup system where they pull up the phone and dial *68 to pick up the group to a team call scenario where they get a toast to pick up the call. Easy to think that's a small change, but going back to our business buy-in slide, that's a change to a workflow they've had for a long time. So be careful to engage the users early, talk to them through the change, how they can work with the new system, and try and cycle in, okay, so this is a change and it might not work exactly as you had it before, but remember you're getting benefits A, B, C, and D as well. So there might be a little bit of pain here, but here's the reward overall. And bring in overall benefits as well, not just benefits to their team. So maybe you're saving £500,000 in PBX maintenance for the business, or maybe you're enabling the business to collaborate globally. It helps put people's fear of change and pain into perspective that, okay, it's changing, but it's for the greater good. On with kind of changes, special regional requirements. This one's really interesting. If you're a global organisation, and lots are here I know, there's certain countries that have very strict regulations around use of VoIP, sometimes use of federation, call recording, user data storage. The classic one is the TRIA in India. There are a number of regulations in India around ensuring that you don't use VoIP to kind of bypass the local carriers. And those present a challenge with Skype for Business. I've done a couple of deployments where it's been involved in India, and you can bridge those gaps. The feature set is there. Again, going technical, it's location-based routing, call and mission control. You can meet the requirements with Skype for Business, absolutely, and I've seen it done, and it's been done firsthand. But be aware of these features, and again, engage early, think about regulatory requirements. Germany's another good one, the German Workers' Council. There's various rules around data retention. There's a great monitoring server in Link that monitors everything you do, so you can troubleshoot calls and you can see stats, but that might not be quite in line with their expectations of what data you're storing on users. So don't assume because you've done it in America or you've done it in the UK that you can instantly roll out around the world without considering local regional impact. And again, if you engage with the business early and local IT teams, you'll usually find they're fairly up to speed on these requirements. Last one here is call or session recording. So it would have been call recording, but remember in Link we're doing voice, video, desktop sharing. So often that's moving to session recording, where I actually need to record instant messages and voice and video and maybe even desktop sharing. Again, this can all be done with Link or Skype for Business. I'm going to have to keep using those interchangeably, aren't I? Eventually I'll get it out. Third-party solutions are the way to go there. There's a number of ISVs that are certified by Microsoft. Talk to those guys, talk to Microsoft, look at the certified partners, understand your requirements, and make sure you, again, engage early and test with these third-party solutions to make sure they meet your compliance and regulatory requirements. Very important stuff. I mean, this is legal requirements, and it's easy to steamroller a rollout and not realise you're impacting legal requirements on the business. Skype for Business depends on a solid infrastructure. It doesn't stand alone. Skype for Business is great, it's really robust, it will do the best it can in any kind of scenario, but it relies on a lot of IT infrastructure to be successful. So networks is the typical one, but also a bunch of other Microsoft technologies, the servers, maybe virtualization, DNS, DHCP, certificate authorities. What they are probably doesn't matter explicitly in terms of a business or best practices track, but make sure you understand what those dependencies are, and again that you're working with those teams or the people responsible for those technologies to ensure they're ready for Skype for Business. The real challenge is, and unfortunately I've seen this with a rollout where the customer did it in-house, the users don't care that it's not a Skype for Business issue that's causing the issue. The only thing they see is Skype for Business on their desktop and their call or their voice or their video not working. And I've sat there with a guy who's responsible for installing it, and he's like, it's great, but the network team just can't get this right. And it's so important to get across that, but the users don't really understand or care. You haven't had a success because it doesn't work for the users. It's all well and good you've set your servers up right, but that kind of means nothing to the business. So again, going back to the kind of idea of virtual teams and getting everybody involved, make sure all your dependencies are lined up and you've got people on board across the business, particularly in terms of different areas of IT and bigger businesses, to be sure you're ready for your rollout and your support. So here's a little list of dependencies. I won't go through them all. Unified messaging is a big one. Exchange is required for the voicemail for Skype for Business. I've seen a number of rollouts where people don't talk to the Exchange team and kind of just assume that they can provide the voicemail unified messaging and it'll all be fine. If you have a voicemail on your existing PBX and you don't have it on Skype for Business, user impacting. Networks, bandwidth, call of mission control, quality of service, that's probably the number one in terms of direct impact. A bad network will be quickly found out by Skype for Business, and often only when you're at scale as well. So work closely with your network team to make sure they're ready for voice and video, and that might involve them auditing their network stack in terms of switching and config. It might even involve doing a full network audit, and there's a number of third parties that can provide that service, which will give you some kind of guarantee that you're ready for Skype for Business. Power over Ethernet on the switches, rolling out IP phones, that's often important. Internet, firewalls, all important stuff. Wireless is a really interesting one. Maybe more than 3 years ago, Link 2010 time, wireless wasn't even technically supported. So much has changed since then. It's absolutely supported in Link 2013 and in Skype for Business. But now it's almost required. I use a Surface as one of my machines. You have people running around with iPads and various other laptops that don't even have network interface cards for cabled in Ethernet. They're always wireless. Telling your users they have to plug in, it doesn't really fly quite often. And if they can't plug in, they're obviously not going to plug in. So don't ignore wireless. Think about your requirements on wireless, your scaling, and your concurrent usage. All the wireless vendors have a story around real-time media on wireless, some better than others. Aruba, probably now a HP company, are one of the leading guys in that area, but not the only one by any stretch. But there's very specific ways to deploy wireless to support voice and video, and they're not the same way you deploy wireless to support data and email. So don't assume just because you've got a wireless network that everything is going to work for voice and video. And desktop client rollout. It's easy to forget. Oh, thank you. Question, sorry.
Well, not so much a question, just expanding on what you just said.
Sure.
We're actually working with a customer that's, he's on, obviously on.
You shout and I'll repeat.
I'm working with a customer that what the clients, for whatever reason, like to wander around with an earphone and an iPad.
Yep.
And what they fail to realise, the users, is that Wi-Fi is not the same as a mobile phone. So, you know, you can't just wander down the corridor and expect the Wi-Fi to hand off from one Wi-Fi access point to the next. And the other thing that you find is quite often is that people tend to wander off into stairwells if they want to have private conversations by telephone because they're used to doing that with a mobile phone. And of course the stairwells and places like that are exactly where you don't have conventional Wi-Fi coverage. So
yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
Just an expansion. You can get access points that do handovers. There are very few, but they're not common and they're expensive, etc., etc.
Yeah, you're right, and that, I've seen those cases too, and I'm one of those guys that when I get on the phone I wander around, hence I'm wandering back and forth on the stage probably. There's, as you say, there's technical ways to solve that problem, and there's a training requirement there. You're investing in a wireless system that will be ready for this kind of technology, or you're taking the time to explain to the users. And I think it's a fair assumption of a user to say, well, I use a mobile and now I've got Skype for Business on a mobile. I wouldn't expect them as an IT guy to understand that it's a different type of technology. So it's a really good point, and it comes to that training and user engagement requirements. Just on the desktop client rollout, typically you're going to be rolling out the Skype for Business client on desktop machines, also mobiles potentially. That requires looking after, it requires patching, it requires support, and often at a great scale depending on how many users you've got. So engage the desktop team and make sure they're ready to roll it out, they're ready to package it, they're ready to support it and patch it. Particularly with Skype for Business, the client is a patch on the Link 2013 client. So if you're rolling out Skype for Business for the first time, or you've got Link 2013 rolled out, you really need to be on top of the client patching to understand how you control the user experience. What you don't want to do is roll out Link 2013 and accidentally roll out the patch that kicks everybody to Skype for Business UI without realizing, which it has the potential to have if you don't control it. But also, when you're rolling out for the first time, if you haven't rolled out yet, you want to make sure those patches and packages are bundled correctly so the user gets the Skype for Business experience for the first time when they're signing in and using it for the first time. Third-party components might be core to your solution. Almost certainly you're going to have some kind of non-Microsoft component to your Skype for Business solution. It's an ecosystem play from Microsoft. They don't want to do everything, every single part of every single solution, much like their other products. They're looking to provide the core, the 90%, and then expert partners around the whole ecosystem to provide other key components. So gateways, which we talked about earlier, those will come from third parties, your Sonuses, your audio code, your Acme packets, and at least a dozen others that are certified. Room-based video, call recording we spoke about earlier, operator consoles, billing and analysis. All these, either there's some limited feature set in the box, but you might need to expand on it, or for the case of, say, contact center or operator consoles, third parties are really the only solution there. Think about, when you're choosing these, who you're working with. Are they qualified? Have they done the testing with Microsoft to make sure that they're supported? Are they really bought into the Skype for Business proposition, or are they just dabbling? You're trying to make a long-term architectural solution. You want to know you're with a partner that's committed to that track. Investigate your options, test them in the lab, test them in production, use IT. Make sure that you consider patching and support, not just deployment. Those are now part of your system. It is a unified communications system, not just Skype for Business. Consider the impact of these. Also, walking around the show, I've been talking about third parties a lot. One of the things I always say is talk to third parties about references. Nothing kind of cuts to the chase of how good a solution is as to talking to third parties and saying, look, can I just talk to some reference sites? Because the good ones will throw you 3 or 4 very quickly. That's the quickest way I find working with third parties to say which one is the right one for me. And remember to consider high availability and disaster recovery, which leads me into my next slide. Planning and testing, and critically testing high availability and disaster recovery. It's all well and good drawing out a plan, but a plan is nothing without testing. Anybody who's been in IT more than 5 minutes probably appreciates that. But it's easy to overlook in Skype for Business. You roll out to 100 users and it's all fine, and you're not going to test on 100 users because they're just friends and family, and they're our test case, and if it goes down, it goes down. Business takes off, it's really good. Now it's 500. Now we're going to scale it out. Now it's 1,000, 2,000. And before you know it, now we've got 2,000 or 3,000 users, and we haven't actually done our HADR testing. So be aware of testing that both when you initially deploy the system, but also as you scale out. Your infrastructure will change, your dependencies will change. Consider testing in a kind of quarterly, maybe annually, biannually, whatever is appropriate for your business, either during your patching cycles or have full-on blackout tests or just Link or Skype for Business blackout tests. Doesn't really matter what your system is, but make sure that is part of your process for your unified communications platform. A few things that often get overlooked, your carrier dependency. So I've seen people do blackout tests and test outbound calling and all is fine. but actually the carrier, the entity responsible for making the calls come into the system, hasn't realised the primary system is down. So they've always tested outbound, they've never tested inbound. You don't want to find that out for the first time for real. Branch sites often get overlooked. It's all well and good checking the main office, which has the core infrastructure is working fine, but think about your branch sites and their dependency. And certificates on backup pools. Very often in Skype for Business, you'll have a primary live pool, and then you'll have a backup pool running a separate data center. And IT these days, it's pretty reliable. Servers don't tend to smash up every day, touch wood and all that. So it works along fine. And nobody remembers to either patch or change the certificates or look after the backup pool. And again, you don't want to be finding out that for the first time when you have to fail over. User experience is as good or as bad as the endpoint the user is using. There's a whole bunch of endpoints going back to the ecosystem story I was talking about earlier. There's 4 or 5 certified vendors who provide headsets, IP phones, handsets, DECT, wireless, mobile, Bluetooth, everything you can think of, you can get a Skype for Business endpoint. They vary massively in cost and they vary in quality as well. Not always in a kind of linear fashion. It doesn't mean because you're buying the most expensive headset, it's the best headset. Don't try and save tons and tons of money in this area. It's quite easy to get excited here. PBX phones might run you $300, and a headset can be had as little as maybe $50. So people do the math, and it's like, oh great, we're going to save hundreds of thousands of dollars here by rolling out headsets instead of IP phones. If that headset is the user's primary device and they're a heavy comms user, collaboration user, phone user, make sure you're investing in an appropriate device for them. And it might even be more than one device for them. They might be at desk 4 days a week where a comfy DECT headset suits them really well, but one day they're working on the road, in which case they're not going to take a full-on PC base station headset with them. They might want a little mobile headset. It kind of comes down to getting a few different devices in. The device vendors are really supportive of this kind of stuff. They'll happily give you devices to test and compare, and do play with them and don't just test them once in a dark room. Use them for real and get a feel for how they work. And then try and make some decisions around, if you can, standardizing on endpoints, or alternatively deciding they're a commodity play and users can pick between any certified endpoint they want, but you won't support them in terms of looking after them. They just buy a new one when that one goes wrong. It kind of depends on your scale which approach is best there. When you test, remember to test both directions. So just because you're getting a really good audio experience doesn't mean the person on the remote end is getting a really good audio experience. It's a speaker in your ear in terms of the headset, but the mic quality can be really important. So think about that as well. Always go qualified. There's no reason not to. I see quite a lot of people using the headsets that come with their mobile phones or whatever they had lying around. There's a great variance in quality of headsets. Microsoft have a certification process which sets a fairly high benchmark for audio quality, but also for driver support, for working with the Skype business endpoints. So always look for a headset with the certified logo on it or certified on the Microsoft site. IP phones or USB handsets, Skype for Business supports both. Quite often people assume I'm going Skype for Business, I have to have a USB headset. That's not true. There are IP phones from a number of vendors you can have, and it might be appropriate for your business users to still have IP phones. There's nothing wrong with that. It's definitely fashionable to have headsets, and I think if you're a knowledge worker, collaboration worker, then headsets suit you well. You're often at a laptop or a keyboard, but there are plenty of workers that an IP phone might be exactly the right endpoint for them. Particularly if you look at maybe common areas or retail IP phones might fit the bill there. In terms of wireless technologies for headsets, you can get two types. You can get Bluetooth or DECT. Without going too technical, Bluetooth is what you typically have in mobile headsets. It's shorter range, quite often cheaper. DECT is potentially longer range, more channels. There's not a right or wrong here. It's not like you would buy one or the other. You need to profile where you're using the headsets, talk to the vendors, and think about what's right. There are gotchas with these technologies that if you have too many people running on too narrow a band of headset, they can overlap and clash and cause issues with each other. All solvable issues, but you don't want to find out when you roll out. So if you're rolling out wireless headsets, talk with the vendors who know what they're doing, talk to the partners who know what they're doing, and consider that you're carefully controlling how those are rolled out at scale. I talked about mic pickup. There's headsets that have a very high mic pickup and will pick up, everything around you. If you're an exec and you're lucky enough to have a corner office, that might not be a big deal. If you're in a trading floor using this, that might be a very big deal because there's potentially important conversations going either side of you that you don't want the people on the phone to pick up. So the right headset for the right scenario is very important. And get a few options, test them out. Don't feel you need to stick with one vendor particularly. In some ways that'll make your life easier. The headsets have firmware which needs updating, but more often than not, it's not a particularly big job in the grand scheme of things compared to getting the right headset for the right users. Rollout strategy and planning. This loops back to the business buy-in, but this is how do you actually control the rollout of Skype for Business to ensure your success. You're swapping out a business tool. We talked earlier about the phone user who's always used their phone, who's always pressed #68 for their call pickup. Make sure you get it right on day one for that user. You've either trained them ahead of time or you have support on the day, or hopefully both. There's lots of ways to do this. You can have online training, in-person training, classroom, video, floor walking. There's a lot to Skype for Business. Don't think that you can just turn up on the first day and swap out the phone and give the person 5 minutes of, you used to do this, now you can do that, you're all good. Even if you get away with that immediately and walk away, that user is left often a week later completely confused as to what they're supposed to be doing. So think carefully about your training requirements and make sure you've got a support infrastructure set up to deal with the scale of users you're rolling out. If you don't get that first impression right, it's very hard to win back users. Big bang or gradual? In terms of which approach you take, big bang can mean a department, a floor, a building, a country. It kind of depends on your scale. Bear in mind that as you change this communications tool from maybe an IP phone to Skype for Business, you're impacting the way people work, but also features that worked on the PBX might not interoperate with Skype for Business. So if I work in a team where we all sit in a single hunt group, you probably want to move that team at the same time. So they all were on the PBX, now they're all on Skype for Business. That might mean that your rollout is actually cross-building or cross-country, and it's not about doing floor by floor, it's about doing team by team. So don't just assume that geography is controlling your rollout. Think about how users work. And flipping that round, it might be that actually if you can find the teams that do collaborate cross-country, cross-globe, they might be your ideal targets as your first users, because they're going to appreciate the new tools maybe much more than people working together in the same building. So think carefully about big bang or gradual, and who you're going to roll out and when you're going to roll them out. The ideal solution is you roll out and the business users are coming to you trying to get in, trying to get on board with the program. I see this team are using it and we really want to use it too. If you can get that kind of pull through from the business, your project is absolutely winning. And you often get that by having a more measured approach than going in and doing 500 users in a day. That again, there's kind of an IT project win there of we've rolled out really fast, but is success measured by the speed of the rollout, or is it measured by the business being happy? I like to think the latter. Set up, either before the users come to their desk or when the users are there. So there's some requirements to set up, potentially hunt groups called team call groups in Skype for Business, or call forwards, or some of the other features in Skype for Business. You can set those up ahead of time. You can try and map users out and set them all up, or you can work with the users as you roll out and define those and configure them in real time. It's easier generally to configure them in real time, but going back to thinking about who the users are, if they're heavy phone or collaboration users, they might not appreciate that you roll something out to them and it's given to them at 9 o'clock and their hunt group isn't configured until 10:30. That might be fine, it might be completely unacceptable. So think about who you're rolling out to and what their expectation is of this tool. Are they prepared to flex a bit and in the first week feel your way through which features you're going to use and how it's going to work and come to IT and we'll change it as we go? Or do you need to do a really careful engagement up front, engage with the business, the department head, whoever owns that system, and map it all out before you deploy? Both valid, just different scenarios depending on who you're dealing with. Number 9, user training and end user support. I bundle these together because I think they should be thought about together. Quite often we see people having a training program and then not thinking about the help desk, which have to pick up the calls 2 weeks later, or you train up the help desk and assume that's a replacement for training the users. Neither's right in my experience. You need to think about how you train the users building up to the rollout and how you continue to hold their hand, support them during and after the rollout. I think I've mentioned this before, there's a whole stack of features in Skype for Business. You know, I use it every day and you still come across things that, oh, that's cool, I didn't know I could do that. Think about how much you're giving the users and then think about how you're not going to be able to train them on all of that in a morning 20-minute session. Quite often people try and cram all that training into one session and here's instant messaging and here's presence, here's federation, watch me do a video, watch me do a desktop share. Particularly if it's a more IT-led thing, we get excited about all the features and run through them. You probably want to revisit your users a few times and maybe use a few different modalities, maybe have an in-person training and some stuff on your internal SharePoint intranet and maybe some videos. Work with users at their own pace to get them up to speed on the features and functionality. And don't be surprised if some users really engage and actually want to know more, and other users just want to know how to make a phone call and then they're out. If you can keep supporting the users as they want to be supported while trying to feed in as much of the features and functionality as you can, you tend to have more success. And think about wraparounds 1 month out, 3 months out. So I might have only wanted to know how to do voice calls because I was very busy just before you rolled out, but now I've had Skype for Business for a month and maybe now's the time you talk to me about video or desktop sharing or collaboration. It's not all training, then we roll out and then training are off. It's kind of a life cycle process of how do we improve the user's experience over time. So good end user support. That's the difference between kind of fail, okay, good and great in terms of user experience, I think. It's often overlooked. You invest in a training team, you get business analysts in, you get all the requirements right. great training, everybody's happy. The user tends to only want to know how to do something when they want to do something. So if I'm setting up a conference and I can't remember how to do it, I'm going to hit the help desk typically. And if the help desk don't know what they're doing, then my experience is poor. This loops back to getting IT on first. If IT know what they're doing with Skype for Business, they've been running with it for 2 months before we even rolled it out, odds are they're going to do a desktop share, they're going to show you how to do it, and all is good. If you've taken the decision to roll out to the business and not to the IT support desk, I think, to be honest, you're in trouble in terms of support. The support desk either have to be really good to the point where they can use a different tool but still remember how to use Skype for Business and support the users, or more likely, they'll be a bit fumbly, and that just impacts the user terribly. So make sure your support team as up to speed as you can, and ideally as up to speed as your training resources in terms of your rollout. Long after the training is gone, those guys are going to be hit for questions and problems and issues. On the training side, I think it's worth understanding that it's a specialist skill set. A bit like support is a specialist skill set. I don't think I have the patience to be a full-time support guy, if I'm honest, or a full-time trainer. You have to be enthusiastic and be really kind of knowledgeable and excited to teach people this stuff again and again, and be just as helpful and comfortable the 50th time you're showing somebody how to do something. So think about the people you've got in those positions, particularly in the training, particularly in the support, and maybe you've got champions either in the business or you bring them into the business to help support the Skype for Business rollout. The better the support experience, the better the training experience, the better the rollout. It's always the case. Infrastructure and support and lifecycle management. So this is our last point of the session. I've kind of dwelled on the support thing. Support is vital. So we've talked about end user support, but also we need to think about support of the infrastructure. We've talked about all the dependencies we have in Skype for Business, networks, DNS, certificates, bunch of IT stuff for those who aren't in the IT or more on the business track. Make sure all of those guys are working together to support your platform. Also think about your third parties. Those things need support, patching. You need a team that's ready to support all of that. There's a bunch of options. You can do it all in-house. Microsoft will support you through Premiere or whatever the support processes you have with them. And partners, obviously, can offer support. Bear in mind, if you're doing it in-house or you're working with Microsoft, have you got all the skill sets covered? So you might have a really good knowledge of servers, but do you have that same depth knowledge of Skype for Business? Or you might have Skype for Business covered, but do you have support of the recording platform or the gateways? So think about your solution holistically and think about where your support gaps might be. And there's certainly partners who will offer a flexible support model to maybe bridge the gaps for you. Monitor your usage, but monitor your service as well. There's tons of good monitoring platforms. There's Microsoft SCOM. There's a number of third parties. Microsoft spend a lot of time providing tooling in terms of the performance of the system and the experience of the system. If you're not monitoring, you're kind of doing it wrong. You need to understand what's going on with your system in terms of how much it's being used, but also what's the experience. Are people getting quality calls? Are people getting quality video? Are there issues on your network? Are there issues between offices? It's not a fire and forget product. It's a put it in and monitor it and look after it type product. Finally, life cycle management. On the lines of it's not a fire and forget, there's ongoing patching, ongoing support. We all understand Microsoft are in this kind of new agile, cloud-first type deployment model, and we're seeing that in Skype for Business just like we are everywhere else. New features come in the patches, new security enhancements come in the patches, both on the desktop and on the infrastructure. And again, your third parties, those need patching support updates. So think about how you're going to control that whole life cycle management of the solution and support it over time, not just day one. So that was my top 10. I just want to leave you with 3 areas to remember. So success is defined by the business, not by IT. Business user buy-in, IT and telecoms buy-in, and business policy decisions. Those are the 3 areas you need to think about in terms of your business for success. Supporting infrastructure. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. A bit cliche these days, but still very true, and very true with Skype for Business. Solid infrastructure, third-party components, and that HADR plan. Make sure you've got all those in play. And finally, rollout and support. So we talked about getting the right endpoint. We've talked about training and user adoption, your rollout strategy and all the planning that goes around that, and the ongoing support of the infrastructure, both the users, their software, patching, headsets, also the infrastructure, network, servers, gateways. So those are my 3 points of summary. I hope you've enjoyed the session. Thank you very much for spending your last session with me. I hope it's been useful. If you've got any questions, feel free to shout out now or come and see me afterwards. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Tom?
Yep.
In this morning's troubleshooting Skype for Business session,
Yep.
Tim and Timothy did a deep dive into the monitoring tools, CLS Logger, the connectivity analyzer, and Snooper, and Fiddler. And they didn't mention SCOM at all. But is the Skype for Business management pack mature, or from the SCOM, did you mean build your own to...
Yeah, no, there's a Skype for Business server has just come out. The management pack for Skype for Business server is imminent but not released yet, I think, in terms of timeline. But there's a very mature Link 2013 SCOM pack that you can just deploy and away you go. So I would expect the Skype for Business equivalent of that imminently.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Being on both sides of the fence, as you mentioned earlier, what would you say would be your #1 recommendation when integrating Cisco CUCM with Skype for Business?
I mean, Cisco CUCM is like any other IP PBX, really. You want to make sure that you've got your dial plan set up properly so that you can do short dials between the 2 systems, and think about where your voice is routing between the 2 systems. In terms of the immediate technical stuff, really what you want to think about is, are your Cisco team and Cisco support team ready to help success of Skype for Business? You might be running 2 systems side by side for some time, so make sure both teams are on board of working together. That's the #1, really.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned the training bot on the slide. What is that?
So that's actually, I work for Modality Systems, and we have a training bot that's essentially like a virtual user, if you think about it like that, and it can push training content to users. So you can either set it up to say, on day 1 they get this video, on day 2 they get that video, on day 3 they get that one. But you can also set it up so that if you see they're not using very much desktop sharing or not using very much video, maybe you proactively push training content to them. If you want to know more, I can drop you a card and we can go through it.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Question about the content in terms of the focus. You were focusing a lot on the voice component of Skype for Business and how important it is to manage that. And I noticed that you didn't really mention a lot about the other components in terms of complexity. Is it that simple to set up for an organization that already has voice in place that they're comfortable with, that doesn't want to move to a 100% Skype for Business voice solution?
Yeah, well, on voice, because instant messaging and presence is easy. It's a kind of a bit of a fire. It's not very dependent on the network as much as voice is. And voice has all the interoperability with your existing PBX. In terms of you wanting to stay with a PBX, you need to think carefully about that, because Skype for Business is a voice platform. So if your user has a PBX phone and Skype for Business, which is fine, and lots of people do, if they want to join a conference on Skype for Business, they then use a USB headset potentially, or they dial in from their IP phone. But it's not quite as slick as the native experience. So you need to think carefully about how you train your users to say, in this scenario, you might use your USB headset, or you might dial into your conference on your IP phone. In that scenario, you just use the IP phone. So I can dial other Skype to Business users in the business on Skype for Business, but I can't dial PBX users. And the problem with that is lots of people use it. People will come into the business who have used it elsewhere and might not have the same expectation. So it can be done, it just needs careful thoughts.
I know that in our organization, we have a phone system that the leadership team, I wouldn't believe, is interested in moving away from at this point. We're running Cisco, obviously, the Unity product. So in that aspect where the company doesn't want to get rid of the system completely or replace it, have you, in your experience, seen Skype or its predecessor, Linked, work well with the system in itself?
Yeah.
As just a partner relationship?
Yeah, I mean, it's in terms of interop between the two systems, they use a standards-based SIP protocol. So the two can sit side by side quite happily. Having come from the Cisco background, it was quite funny because Cisco obviously came and replaced a lot of the old school digital and TDM. And in those days, it was like, well, it's fine. You can do a bit of TDM and a bit of Cisco and it'll all be fine. Cisco, obviously, times have changed. Their story now is it's best just to all be Cisco. And that makes sense for them. But the fact is the two systems can sit side by side just fine. It's just thinking about the user experience. You do want to connect the two systems together, if nothing else, just so your Cisco users can dial into a Skype for Business conference. What you'll probably find is over time, you'll find some use cases, work from home, road warriors, where the Skype for Business experience might suit them better than the Cisco IP phone. And then you just have to think about, do we continue to run hybrid, if you like, term it like that, two systems in play, or do we have certain users use one system and certain users use the other? It can all be done, but it just requires a little more training and a little more understanding. But it's often the first step is a trunk between the two systems. So don't feel you need to do it like big bang, Skype for Business in, Cisco out. You'll be in hybrid for a while, that's fine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to piggyback off his question.
Sure.
We're a company, we're using Link Online, Skype for Business Online
cool.
for conferencing right now for about 1,500 users. We're actually pulling it back on-prem to do SIP and PBX integration better and eventually begin piloting EV. The company is leaning more towards the Cisco and then the Link, like he was talking about. From the Windows side and the Skype for Business side, I have more reservations about mixing two systems just from an end user experience. Soft phones and then your Link clients, Skype clients.
Yep.
What are some things as a customer trying to present to the business, valid reasons of why, we should be doing Skype, cost savings, versus maybe a traditional Cisco type go-to solution?
Yeah, cost savings is a big one. Quite often with Microsoft, we'll have an enterprise agreement or an Office 365 subscription where some of the cost of this solution will already be embedded in that potentially. So that's often a starting point for this kind of stuff. But
so like an E4 Cal?
Yeah, exactly. If you've got E4, you've paid for a large proportion, not all, but a large proportion of Skype for Business. Mm-hmm. Whereas you'd have to pay that on the Cisco stack. On the flip side, you might have that invested. But I wouldn't dwell on that. I'd focus on user experience. If possible, get the two systems set up side by side and have sessions with the business where you say, here's an option and here's an option. Because going back to what we said at the start of this talk, the business buy-in and the business sponsorship will get you everywhere. If you get business users saying, I'd rather have this experience than that experience, that speaks volumes often more than a potential cost saving where they know they're spinning up a project and there's cost associated with the project anyway. if you can say, well, the users say they'd rather have this, then you're generally on the right track.
Have you seen a lot of customers with the frustration of two different technologies for?
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
environment?
It's hard for me to say it doesn't work, because it does work. It's just not as slick.
Okay.
And everybody moving away from Cisco has some period of where two systems coexist, and that might be weeks, it might be months, it might be years. But I don't think anybody can argue it's as slick to have a Cisco IP phone and Skype for Business as it is to have Skype for Business and maybe a Skype for Business IP phone. Obviously, the Microsoft stack works better than integrating with the Cisco stack.
So what would be the argument for saying that maybe Skype for Business isn't as mature as some of those other products?
Yeah, I mean, talk to partners and get references. Again, I work for Modality Systems, talk to a bunch, but if you can get half a dozen references relevant to either your size or your vertical, that's the strongest case.
Okay.
Right? Once you've got that, then the business can't say it's not ready, and there are hundreds of thousands of seats of Link 2013, which is obviously the predecessor, that you can use as references for that.
And in regards to endpoints, we've had some conversations with some vendors that have said that Cisco and Link in coexistence don't work very well on some computers, so I guess that could tarnish end user.
Yeah, again,
experience.
it's works versus good is kind of the question. The best thing you can do is get some demo systems set up and feel it firsthand.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cool. I think we're about there for time. I'll jump off. If anybody's got anything else, I'll be down here. Thank you very much, guys.